I was 20 when I first moved into my own place, a small, cozy apartment on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet area, surrounded by trees and far enough from the main roads that the only sounds at night were the occasional rustling of leaves and distant hum of passing cars. It felt like the perfect escape from the bustle of the city, a place where I could finally have some peace and quiet. One Friday night, after a long week at work, I decided to stay in, watch a movie, and relax. The clock read 11:30 p.m. when I finally turned off the TV, feeling drowsy. I went through my nightly routine and crawled into bed, looking forward to a good night's sleep. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a knock at the door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was late, too late for someone to be knocking on my door. I stayed still, hoping that maybe it was just my imagination. But then the knock came again, louder this time, followed by a muffled voice. "Hey, are you in there? I need help." The voice was deep, male, and unfamiliar. I felt a chill run down my spine. I lived alone, and no one should be visiting me at this hour. My first instinct was to ignore it, but the knocking persisted, becoming more insistent. "Please, I just need to use your phone. My car broke down." Something about the situation felt off. My apartment was at the end of a long driveway, and there was no way someone would just stumble upon it. And why wouldn't he have a cell phone of his own? I reached for my phone and checked the peephole, holding my breath. Standing outside was a tall man, his face partially obscured by the shadow of a hood. He was pacing back and forth, his movements agitated. Every alarm bell in my head was going off, telling me to stay away from the door. I quietly backed away, trying to keep calm. I decided to call the police, but before I could dial, the knocking stopped. The sudden silence was unnerving. I listened, straining to hear any sound, but there was nothing. Then, I heard a new sound, a scraping noise coming from the back of the apartment, where the kitchen window was. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. He was trying to find another way in. I moved quickly, grabbing a kitchen knife for protection. I could hear the sound of something tapping against the glass, followed by a quiet curse. He was struggling with the lock. "Get out of here!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "I've called the police!" There was a pause, and for a moment, I thought he might leave. But then, with a sudden violent crash, the window shattered. I screamed, backing into the living room as I heard him climb through the broken glass. My heart pounded in my chest as I desperately looked for a way out. The front door was too far, and he was already in the apartment. I could hear his heavy footsteps in the kitchen, getting closer. I ran to the bedroom and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the knife. I backed up against the wall, holding my breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps stopped outside my door. There was a moment of eerie silence, then a soft knock. "Come on out," the man said, his voice calm, almost coaxing. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to talk." The doorknob rattled as he tried to open the door, and I pressed myself harder against the wall, hoping it would somehow keep him out. The wood creaked as he leaned against the door, his breath heavy and labored. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for him to break down the door. My eyes darted to the window in the bedroom, and I realized it was my only chance. I quickly unlocked it and pushed it open, glancing back at the door as I did. The man must have heard the window because he started banging on the door, trying to force it open. I climbed out of the window, the cold night air hitting me as I dropped to the ground. The bushes scratched at my legs, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I ran through the backyard, not daring to look back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I reached the edge of the property and darted into the woods, the trees providing some cover. I kept running, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't have my phone, and the nearest neighbor was at least a mile away. As I ran, I could hear footsteps behind me, crashing through the underbrush. He was chasing me. I pushed myself to go faster, my legs burning with the effort. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could hear the man's labored breathing as he closed in on me. My lungs felt like they were on fire, but I couldn't stop. If I stopped, he would catch me. Suddenly, I saw a light up ahead, a faint, flickering light through the trees. It was the neighbor's house. I had to make it there. I could hear the man behind me, so close now that I could almost feel him reaching out for me. With one final burst of energy, I sprinted towards the light. bursting out of the woods and onto the neighbor's lawn. I screamed for help, hoping someone would hear me. The footsteps behind me stopped, and I turned around to see the man standing at the edge of the woods, just out of reach of the light. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared back into the darkness. The door to the house opened, and the neighbor, an elderly man, stepped out with a flashlight, asking what was going on. I collapsed onto the ground, sobbing, trying to explain what had happened. The police arrived not long after, searching the area, but they found no sign of the man. I was too shaken to return to my apartment that night, so I stayed with the neighbors until morning. When the sun came up, I went back with the police, but nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed, except for the broken kitchen window. I moved out of that apartment the next day, never looking back. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I know one thing for sure. If I hadn't escaped when I did, I might not be here to tell this story. Growing up, I lived in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. Our house was a modest two-story, nestled at the end of a long, winding street. It was a peaceful place, the kind where everyone knew each other, and nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. That is, until one fateful night when I was 17 years old. My parents were out of town for the weekend, attending a wedding. They trusted me to take care of the house, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening of watching movies and playing video games. It was around 10 p.m. when I decided to pause the movie I was watching and grab a snack from the kitchen. As I walked down the dark hallway, the faint sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor above me stopped me in my tracks. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I was alone in the house, or at least, I thought I was. I stood there, frozen, trying to convince myself that it was just the house settling. But the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the upstairs hallway to the other. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my heart pounding in my chest. I crept up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I reached the top, I noticed the door to my parents' bedroom was slightly ajar. The light was off, but I could see the faint outline of someone standing inside. The figure moved, and I quickly ducked behind the corner. My mind raced. Who could it be? How did they get in? I had locked all the doors, hadn't I? I took a deep breath and peeked around the corner again. The figure was now facing the door, their face obscured by shadows. Suddenly, the door creaked open wider, and the figure stepped out into the hallway. I could see now that it was a man, tall and gaunt, with wild, unkempt hair. He was holding something in his hand, something that glinted in the dim light. It looked like a knife. Panic set in. I was trapped. My only way out was past him, down the stairs and out the front door. But I knew I couldn't outrun him. I had to be smart. I silently backed into the guest bedroom and closed the door as quietly as I could. I locked it and pressed my ear against the door, listening. The footsteps grew closer. He was coming down the hallway, slowly, methodically, as if he knew exactly where I was. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. There was no way out. The windows in the guest room were old and stuck. They wouldn't open. I was trapped. I heard him stop outside the door. My breath caught in my throat. There was a long, agonizing silence. Then suddenly, the doorknob rattled. I nearly screamed, but clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle the sound. The knob rattled again, harder this time, followed by a soft, menacing chuckle. Come out, wherever you are." The voice was low, raspy, and dripping with malice. I backed away, my eyes darting around the room for anything I could use to defend myself. There was nothing but old furniture and a dusty lamp. The door rattled again, this time with more force, as if he was trying to break it down. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed the lamp and yanked the cord from the wall, holding it like a makeshift weapon. I backed into the farthest corner of the room, my eyes locked on the door, waiting for it to burst open. But then, the rattling stopped. The silence was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and erratic. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed, expecting him to come crashing through at any moment. Minutes passed. Then I heard it, a soft creak, not from the door, but from the floorboards above me. I realized with a sickening dread that he had moved on. He was still in the house, but where? I waited for what felt like hours, my mind racing with terror. Finally, I heard the sound of a door closing somewhere downstairs. I crept to the window and peeked out, hoping to see him leaving. But the street was empty, and the house was silent once again. Gathering every ounce of courage, I slowly unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. It was empty. I made my way downstairs, knife still in hand, and checked every room. The front door was wide open, a cold breeze blowing in from outside. He was gone. But the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I locked the door and called the police, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I explained what had happened. They arrived within minutes, but by then, the man was long gone. They searched the house and found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of who he was or why he had targeted me. But there was one thing they did find. On the floor of the guest bedroom where I had been hiding was a small, blood-stained note. It simply read, "Next time, you won't be so lucky." To this day, I still don't know who that man was or how he got into my house. But one thing is certain. I'll never forget the terror of that night and the feeling that, somewhere out there, he's still watching, waiting for another chance. I was 17 when my parents decided to take a last-minute weekend trip to visit some relatives out of state. They trusted me enough to leave me home alone, and I was excited about the idea of having the house to myself. I wasn't much of a party person, so I planned to spend the weekend binging horror movies and maybe inviting a couple of friends over. It was a quiet Friday evening when they left. The neighborhood was typically peaceful, and most of the houses were dark by 10 p.m. After making myself some popcorn, I settled down in the living room to watch one of my favorite horror flicks. The only light in the room came from the TV screen, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I was halfway through the movie when I heard a faint sound coming from the back of the house. It was a soft, repetitive tapping. At first I thought it was just the wind, but as the tapping continued, it became more deliberate, almost like someone was lightly knocking on the back door. My heart began to race, but I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was just a branch or something. But then, the tapping stopped, and there was a loud thud, as if something heavy had fallen against the door. I paused the movie, straining to listen. The house was completely silent now, except for the sound of my own breathing. I was about to get up and check it out when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Why don't you come to the back door?" Chills ran down my spine. I glanced at the time, 11:47 p.m. There was no way this was a coincidence. Someone was outside, and they were trying to lure me out. I typed a quick response, trying to keep my hands steady. "Who is this?" Almost immediately, I received another message. "Just come outside. I need to talk to you." I was terrified, but I didn't want to show it. My first instinct was to call the police, but I didn't want to overreact in case it was just a prank. Instead, I decided to ignore the texts and lock all the doors and windows in the house. I made my way to the back door, where the noise had come from earlier. The porch light was off, but I could see the silhouette of a figure standing just beyond the glass. I froze, my hand hovering over the lock. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring at me through the glass. My phone buzzed again. "Let me in." I slowly backed away from the door, trying to make as little noise as possible. I had no intention of letting this person inside, whoever they were. I turned off the lights in the kitchen and tiptoed back to the living room, where I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. As I waited for the dispatcher to pick up, I heard the sound of glass shattering from the back of the house. The person was trying to break in. I ran upstairs and locked myself in my bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest. I whispered into the phone, trying to explain the situation to the dispatcher as quietly as possible. The dispatcher assured me that the police were on their way, but it would take at least 10 minutes for them to arrive. I didn't think I had that long. I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate, like the person was taking their time. My bedroom door was the only thing separating me from whoever was in the house. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, praying that they would go away. But then, the doorknob slowly began to turn. I backed away, grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp, and held it up, ready to defend myself. The door creaked open, and a tall, shadowy figure stepped into the room. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell they were smiling, a creepy, almost sinister smile. They took a step closer, and I swung the lamp with all my strength, hitting them square in the head. The figure stumbled, but didn't go down. Instead, they reached out, grabbing my wrist with a cold, clammy hand. I screamed and yanked my hand away, backing up until I hit the wall. The figure lunged at me, and I swung the lamp again, this time connecting with their side. They let out a low growl and staggered back, giving me just enough time to run past them and out of the room. I raced down the stairs, hearing the figure crashing after me. I knew I couldn't outrun them for long, but I had to try. Just as I reached the front door, I heard sirens blaring in the distance. Relief washed over me as I flung the door open and ran outside, waving frantically at the approaching police cars. The officers jumped out and rushed towards the house, guns drawn. I watched from the safety of the driveway as they stormed inside. Moments later, they emerged, dragging the figure out in handcuffs. As they passed me, I finally got a good look at the intruder's face. It was the last person I expected to see, an old family friend who had helped my parents with some renovations years ago. I hadn't seen him in years, but he had always seemed so normal, so kind. The officers told me later that he had been stalking me for weeks, planning this night. They found a bag in his car filled with duct tape, rope, and other items that sent shivers down my spine. My parents rushed home the next day, and we spent the rest of the weekend at a hotel. I never stayed home alone again after that. The memory of that night still haunts me, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't fought back. But one thing's for sure, I'll never underestimate the dangers of being home alone again.